Order. On behalf of the committee, can I welcome our witnesses this morning from left to right as I see it. Sir Jonathan Fall, Chair of European Public Affairs with the Brunswick Group, Larissa Brunner, Policy Analyst from the European Policy Centre, and Charles Grant, Director of the Centre for European Reform. We are very grateful to all three of you for giving both of your time and your great experience to the committee today as we are looking at what's happening in Europe and is likely to happen in Europe and how that's going to impact upon the Brexit process. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so as succinct answers as possible while informing us would be much appreciated. And can I kick off? There's a lot of back and forth debate about the Spitzenkandidat process and how the new President of the Commission is going to be chosen. It'd be very helpful to hear from you where you think it's got to. I don't know who wants to kick off first.
With each other.
Yeah.
All right.
So, Jonathan, why don't you start?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a big issue of which the European Council will have to take account when it gets to choosing the President of the Commission. The treaty says that it takes account of the elections. The elections are again being fought with the Spitzenkandidaten known and present and presenting themselves as such. There is no legal obligation on the European Council to follow that idea to its final conclusion. They did last time. It will depend on a number of factors, the main one of which will be the composition of the European Parliament as a result of the elections.
Okay. Mr. Grant?
I think it's very much an open issue, as an open question as to whether the Spitzenkandidaten system will prevail this time. The general, I think, mood in Brussels is it probably won't, because Macron is strongly opposed to it. Last time, the Parliament managed to impose its system on the European Council, despite it not being written down anywhere in the treaties, because the three main Spitzenkandidaten, Verhofstadt, Juncker and Schulz, got together before the elections to say we'll back each other and bring our cohorts in the Parliament behind a common line for whoever represents the party with the most votes, with the most MEPs. And that works. So right after the European elections, the Parliament basically had a unified line. This is what we want, and the European Council had a lot of qualms about it, but basically caved into the Parliament, and Merkel gave into the Parliament, partly because of the pressure at home as well. This time, the Parliament's much more divided. Power is not concentrated in a group of 2 or 3 people running the Parliament, and the Spitzenkandidaten don't like each other particularly, as far as I can see, and don't get on particularly well, so they're not going to all agree to back each other to impose the Parliament's wishes on the European Council. So unless the Parliament gets its act together immediately after the elections and says, this is our line, this is what we want, the European Council will play a much bigger role than it did last time. The question really is whether the existing Spitzenkandidaten, or possibly other people of a similar quality, similar characters, such as Mr. Barnier, who's certainly much talked about, get the job, or whether, because of a blockage that persists for some time, in the end, the European Council goes for somebody bigger, I mean, a head of state and government, because the previous, every Commission President since Jacques Delors has been a head of government, and the main Spitzenkandidaten this time are not, and there's a real issue as to whether they want somebody of a higher stature, a higher calibre than the names that are commonly mentioned in the first instance.
Mrs. Merkel, for example?
Well, her name is mentioned in Brussels, and I gather in Berlin too. She has denied she wants any job after her current job, but you know, politicians do change their mind occasionally, don't they? So.
Ms. Brunner?
Yeah, also just to add on the question of Mrs. Merkel, I think For her, domestic political considerations would also play a role because her current coalition is rather unstable. With a lot of discontent within the Social Democratic Party. So if he were to step down as Chancellor and go to Brussels, that could potentially cause a lot of disruption. It could potentially lead to fresh general elections in Germany and to a collapse of the coalition, because I think it may be rather unlikely that the Social Democratic Party would approve her chosen successor, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, as Chancellor. They might see that as an opportunity to end the coalition. So I think that would also factor in Angela Merkel's thinking, and because of that, I think she might be quite reluctant to move, and she might be more inclined to stay in Berlin in her current position to ensure the stability of the coalition. I think two other considerations in the Spitzenkandidat process are that it may not necessarily be an advantage this time to be German for any Spitzenkandidat, because Germans already hold a number of top posts. For example, Martin Sellmayr. There's also the question of whether the next ECB president could be German. So the head of the European Investment Bank is also German. So there are already quite a lot of Germans. So that would be a consideration. And it's also the question of whether a sort of grand coalition in the European Parliament can be formed this time between the European People's Party and the Socialists. And of course, we need to await the European elections, but current polls indicate that that may not necessarily be the case. So if that's not the case, then again, it might be quite difficult to form a coalition around one of the current Spitzenkandidaten.
What implications do you think there will be for Brexit arising from a slightly or quite a lot differently composed European Parliament? Because everyone is saying, one looks at the rise of populist parties, what's likely to happen here in the United Kingdom and in other countries. What effect playing out through appointment of the President, approving commissioners and so on, what impact do you think that might have on the European Union's attitude to Brexit?
I would say not a huge difference.
Not a huge difference?
No, because,
okay.
Because the European Parliament is highly likely to approve the withdrawal agreement if the British can ever approve it. And that, because if Barnier says it's a good deal, go for it, they will go for it. And after the European elections, even if, as is quite possible, the populist right-wing Eurosceptics get, say, 25% of the seats, which is plausible, they won't be running the Parliament. Instead of the Parliament has been run for many years by a coalition of EPP and Socialists and Democrats. That won't be able to do it anymore. They'll bring in the liberal centrist group, ALDE, and possibly the Greens as well. So there'll be a new and different coalition running it. It'll be more difficult to run the Parliament because there'll be more players involved. But the European Parliament doesn't negotiate Brexit anyway. All it has to do is approve the deal. So I think it's not any less likely to approve the deal post the elections.
The reason for my question is it's really the political impact on member states as they see those results, rather than what the European Parliament can or cannot do. Do you think member states will look at that and think, now what does that mean for us in the future when we come to face elections, and therefore is that going to impact in any way on their attitude to Brexit?
Well, I don't want to hold the conversation. I think not hugely, because the member states are, at least the governments in the member states, are convinced they've taken the right approach to Brexit.
Okay.
There's not a lot of questioning going on as to whether they should have done it rather differently. They've got what they wanted in the Brexit deal by standing together and being very united. Obviously, some differences have emerged recently, which we'll perhaps come on to. But I don't think they're going to say if a lot of populists do well in the European elections, that means there's something fundamentally wrong with the European Union and therefore the way we've handled Brexit. I think most people don't like to admit they get anything wrong, do they?
They don't, but do you think in quieter moments they say to themselves, we're going to need some change in the European Union or not? Because there's obviously a lively debate.
I think there is what I defer to Larissa on Germany, but certainly within Germany, the government thinks it's still got everything right about Brexit. But there are voices outside the government which do ask the questions you're suggesting, Mr. Ben. And I think in other countries too, non-governmental voices are saying, have we got this right? Even in the Commission, one hears occasional voices now saying, maybe did we get things entirely the right way? Should we have done something a bit differently? So I suppose that there may be more questioning. But I mean, the EU is that doesn't mean the EU is going to say, well, let's just scrap the withdrawal agreement or rewrite it or abandon the Irish backstop or whatever. There's no way that's going to happen just because of the European elections, in my view.
Sure. I was thinking more of pressures from other member states for reforming the way in which the European Union works. So not just about Brexit, but the pressures that are coming up in other member states because of the changing nature of politics.
Well, Mr. Macron is the only European leader, as far as I can see, who has a kind of clear programme of reform for the EU, but he hasn't got a lot of support from other member states at the moment. A few, like Spain and Belgium, are quite sympathetic, but Germany hasn't been as sympathetic as he would have wished. So his ideas for a kind of concentric circle Europe are not going very far at the moment, and other leaders don't really have ideas for reform. The Poles, Hungarians and some others want a more national government-based EU, but again, then the EU reforms very slowly and with great difficulty, and I don't think we're right for a period of massive reform at the moment.
Okay, Ms. Brunner?
I think it's not difficult to find people in Brussels and in the member states who agree that the EU should be reformed. What's much more difficult, I think, is to get people to agree on what the reformed EU should actually look like. And I think in a way, my impression is that the EU has treated the Brexit process rather separately from the EU reform process. I think my sense is that it sees Brexit as a technical issue, and it maybe hasn't fully considered the strategic importance of Brexit, and certainly in the public debates that aspect hasn't featured very much. What Brexit means more strategically for the EU going forward, what its strategic relationship with the UK should be after it leaves. So, and at the moment, I think it's very much been contained as a technical issue because even if we look at the withdrawal, so far most of the discussion has been about the withdrawal agreement, so quite technical issues, how to solve the Irish border question, what to do with citizens' rights, with the financial settlement, and less about the bigger picture, what the future of the EU should be and what the future EU-UK relations should be. So I think there was certainly a bit more debate needed on that. And because those processes, I think, have been kept rather separate, I don't think there are a lot of spillover effects from Brexit to the future of the EU reform process. And also after the Brexit referendum, there was a lot of concern about a possible contagion effect or a domino effect, and there were some people worried that similar referenda could take place in other member states, perhaps France, the Netherlands, but that hasn't really materialized at all so far. And actually, if you look at the rhetoric of populist Eurosceptic parties, they've actually toned it down a little bit. So if you look at Marine Le Pen, for example, in France, in the French presidential elections, she suddenly didn't talk so much anymore about leaving the euro or having a referendum on euro area membership because of the way that I think Brexit is going, and because of the way Brexit is perceived in continental Europe. So I think, if anything, Brexit has rather had the opposite effect, and even if populist Eurosceptic parties do very well at the European Parliament elections, which I think is quite likely, I don't think the conclusion by EU leaders is necessarily going to be that they have to make Brexit even harder, or that they have to punish the UK or anything like that, because that is not, because leaving the EU or leaving the euro area, I think, is not really something that a lot of Eurosceptic parties are really advocating for.
Okay, Sir Jonathan.
Yes, I would add that there is a sense, I think, that a new era is beginning, and therefore that an old era is coming to an end, and people are struggling to see where it goes, and it's obviously not very clear, and these things take time. But Brexit is part of that. Developments in the United States, in Russia, in China, in the economy. There is a sense that we have reached the end of a cycle, and Coincidentally, it's the end of a political cycle in Brussels, and therefore there will be a whole bunch of new presidents and leaders of the institutions. And to answer your question a little bit earlier, Mr. Bendy, at least the process of hearing presidents designate, commissioners designate, people will make speeches, people will make commitments, the parliamentarians will try to tease positions out of them. So we will know a lot more in this process about what people want. It may not tell us a great deal more than we know already, but there are going to have to be programs for 5 years set out by the people who are going to be in charge of implementing.
Okay, and just finally, very quickly from me, will a British commissioner be appointed?
Yes. Because the treaties say that member states appoint commissioners. That is a legal requirement on the British to do so.
There is a legal provision for a commission smaller than one composed of nationals of all member states, but it has never been used. It would open a whole Pandora's box. I think the general assumption is that if the United Kingdom is a member state, it has the full rights and obligations of a member state, except for the Article 50 procedure, which is very specific about what it does and what it doesn't do. But for all other purposes, it remains a member state.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Up until the 29th of March, I think most people in this country thought that the Article 50 process meant that we would leave on the 29th of March, whether there was a deal or not. The Prime Minister had vaguely talked in public and private, but maybe extending for a few days or weeks if there was some technical reason to get things signed off. But that was the understanding, and it was also thought rather difficult to get the European Union to agree unanimously to an extension. That has proved to be false. It was done exceptionally quickly, basically by Prime Minister going to Brussels and signing a letter. So we now have a situation where we've got an extension, as I understand it, to the 31st of October, with relatively little conditions, as far as I can see, attached to that. The Prime Minister has gone and signed up to that. We've had no vote in Parliament on that. We've had no debate in Parliament on that. The government changed the primary legislation so that we now have a negative SI procedure. We've also learned, Chairman, recently, I think at the liaison committee, that when the Prime Minister said no deal was better than a bad deal, she didn't actually mean it. It was some abstract thought. So we now know the European Union now understands our position to be, we have to have a deal. We would never go along and say we want to come out on a no-deal basis. I think that's pretty clear. But of course, while we can say that, the European Union has in their power either to grant an extension past the 31st of October if necessary. And I suppose what I'd like your view on is, given that we have such a weak hand in this, saying that we will never accept a no-deal situation, do you think there's likelihood that the European Union will put conditions on any extension, and what would those conditions likely to be?
Well, the discussion about conditions so far have revolved around the question, what do you want an extension for? The question from the EU to the United Kingdom, and what are you going to do during the period between now and the expiry of the extension you want? And as October becomes ever closer, unless the withdrawal agreement has been approved by then, that question will be asked again. And the EU position, as Charles Grant said, likely to endure as the EU position, is that we have agreed with the government of the United Kingdom a withdrawal agreement, and we are waiting for that to be approved by the British Parliament, by this House. And we have a political declaration which can be discussed further, which talks about the possible future relationship to be negotiated once the United Kingdom has left. So all of that will remain, I think, the case after the summer if we're still in this position. And any discussion which will no doubt then emerge about, well, was that extension long enough, is more time needed, will give rise to the same questions again. Why is more time needed? What do you want? And no doubt the question would come back from a British Prime Minister, from the British Prime Minister to the European side. What can you change to give us what we want? Those are the debates which have been going on for a very long time already. You're quite right that the Article 50 procedure was written on the basis that 2 years should be enough. Well, it turns out that they weren't in this case.
Just the point though, do you think that the EU in future, I mean, after all, the Prime Minister went and asked for an extension to the 30th of June, Parliament asked her to ask for the 30th of June, and we finished up with the 31st of October somehow. But there weren't a sort of conditions. It wasn't like paying extra money or having restrictions. Do you think we would just continue as a member and they wouldn't impose any additional conditions on us?
Well, it depends how our rather strange continued membership in this period goes. It depends on how all the individuals behave, to be honest, and whether there is a stable temporary relationship which is established, which people can continue to live with while whatever decisions remain to be taken are debated and taken. But if the relationship turns out to be a very difficult one, a rough one, for whatever reason, then perhaps conditions and duration of possible further extensions will become a hot issue again.
Could I ask your colleagues, if we got to that situation, do you think the EU would ever say, sorry, that's it, you're going to come out on a certain date on a no deal?
Yes. Okay. Well, that's basically Mr. Macron's view. I think if the British government asks for a further extension in October, it is likely but not certain that the EU will agree. You just need one EU member state to say no. And Mr. Macron, before the last European Council in April, was saying that he wanted only a short extension. There are two separate issues here which get confused. One is that the tactics used by the EU to bring this matter to a conclusion. There is a tactical difference between Mr. Macron and most member states. Mr. Macron says if you want to get the British to make up their minds, you've got to show them the cliff edge approaching, so they really either revoke or pass the withdrawal agreement or go for no deal or whatever. Get them to make up their mind. While the other position, Mrs. Merkel and Donald Tusk and most member states, is actually if you give them a very long extension, they wanted to go till next spring, most of them. If you give them a very long extension, then Eurosceptics in the UK will get scared that Brexit might not happen and they'll vote for the withdrawal agreement and pass it. So there was a tactical difference between France and Germany, or France and most member states on that issue. There's this quite separate division, which is similar but not similar memberships of each camp, but not quite the same, which is should the British actually stay in the EU or not? Do we really want the British in the EU? Mr. Macron apparently takes the view, as do the Spanish and some others, that actually the EU might be better off without us, because we are infecting the EU with our weird Eurosceptic politics. We might send funny MEPs saying funny things to the European Parliament. We might disrupt EU business. Indeed, I'm told at the last European Council, 9 heads of state or government cited a tweet by Mr. Rees-Mogg here, where he said more or less, I can't remember the exact words, if we stay in the EU for a bit longer, we should actually sort of cause trouble on the inside. They actually cited that. So there is a strong school of thought that the longer the British stay in, the more they can mess things up from the inside, and therefore they shouldn't stay in too long at all. But while others still hope, like Mr. Tusk, for the British to change their mind in another referendum. So while Mr. Macron is very isolated in his view on the tactics, I think, of the extension, on the issue of whether the British really should stay in or not, he's not so isolated as on that. The Spanish, for example, were for a long extension, but as far as I gather, would quite happily see the British leave the EU.
Do you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I mostly agree. Although I am a bit less optimistic that the EU will automatically grant the UK another extension at the end of October, because as Charles Grant said, you only need one single country voting against it, because you need unanimity for that in the European Council. And so I think it matters not only what countries think and whether they think there should be an extension, but I think also how strongly they feel about that issue. And if you have one country, one single country, that feels very strongly that enough is enough and that there has to be an end, whether it's for tactical reasons or whether it's because they don't want the UK to revoke Article 50, then even if you have a lot of countries who would be open to an extension but don't necessarily feel very strongly about that, it is very much conceivable that those countries will basically concede to the country that has a very strong opinion about it, because so far the EU 27 have been remarkably good at maintaining unity and at finding some sort of compromise and consensus. And I think preserving that in this stage of the negotiations is the main priority. So if that means following the one country that has a very strong opinion, then that might be something they might be willing to do, because I think also, as Charles Grant said, there was a divide at the last European Council meeting, but I think how the next months play out is going to be quite important in shaping attitudes, because if there was this, because the EU said to the UK that it should use the extension wisely, but if there was the sense that this is not really happening, then there might be more who might question the point of a further extension. And there might be some people shifting from the tactical school of thought that you need to give the UK time to make a decision to Macron's school of thought. The UK needs a cliff edge. So I think it's going to be quite important how the coming months play out and whether there is the sense in the EU 27 that there is some progress. And I don't think that another extension is a foregone conclusion at all, and I think there is still the risk of a no-deal scenario.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning. I just wanted to drill down a bit further into what Charles was saying there about changing attitudes within the EU towards the United Kingdom. And I'm afraid I'm going to put you all on the spot a little bit to give us a sense of where the member states actually are. So there is a view that Portugal, Ireland, Poland, Hungary and Donald Tusk want the UK to stay in the European Union. They would like the UK to either revoke or to have a referendum and remain, and all the rest want us out because we have become toxic, a sort of virus in the European body politic. And if we were to have a referendum and remain, potentially ending up then with a hardline Eurosceptic as Prime Minister, but within the European Union at some point in the future, we would simply be back to where we are now, and that would potentially wreck the European project. I'd be very grateful if you could give a sense of where the numbers are in the EU on that question. Perhaps starting with you, Sir Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, there is bemusement, sometimes amusement, and people are fed up. I think across Europe, certainly in institutional Brussels, this has gone on too long. This stable, rational, pragmatic country seems unrecognizable to many watching us. And there is no going back, and I think certain things are irrevocable. I think there have been changes, and again, we don't know where they will necessarily end up, but I think people have given up on the idea that this can suddenly, people are going to wake up and this never happened. Article 50 will disappear and the UK will go back to what it was before, which was a sometimes awkward but largely constructive member state. The balance of power in Europe has been disrupted, will be disrupted when we leave considerably. How it works out in practice, a Europe with France and Germany as without the UK, the two remaining sides of what was the dominant triangle, we'll have to see. But everybody, every single country is now thinking seriously, as we are one way or another moving into the final phase of this, thinking about their future relations with this country and what it means for the way they think about their membership of the European Union. It's not as simple as there's a list of countries on one side, list of countries on the other, because, yes, countries have durable interests, but they also have political shifts going on, and there will be different views. These are all democracies being expressed. But there is still enormous sympathy for the predicament of Ireland in all of this. The unity of the 27 has been remarkable, but to be honest, we made it very easy for them because, forgive me, I'm going to talk about cricket for a minute, the bowling has been pretty easy for the batsmen being Brussels, because they have been able to say maiden over after maiden over, we're waiting for the British to tell us what we want. And we're united around a solid legal position, which they struck pretty early and have stuck to. And there is some vindication in opinion polling that the contagion effect has not worked out as people feared, because we've made such a mess of it that Eurosceptical ardour has in fact diminished across European countries. It doesn't mean that Euroscepticism has gone away, it doesn't mean that populism or nationalism has gone away, but it means that people thinking about their national fate outside the euro or outside the European Union altogether are thinking a lot harder than they used to about what it would really mean in practice. So there is a debate behind the unity of the 27, and that debate will come to the surface even more as we move into the second phase of working out what the future relations between this country and the European Union, and then as the rest of the European Union moves into a new phase with a different balance of power structures between its member states and the Brussels institutions.
Thank you very much. I wasn't able then to pin you down to actual where the member state sits. I'll just give my list again. Poland, Ireland, Hungary, Portugal and Donald Tusk are the only people, member states and an individual, that actually want the United Kingdom to stay in the European Union. Would you agree with that list, Ms. Brunner?
Was that still to me? So have we
Ms.
moved?
Brunner,
Okay,
yeah.
sorry. I mean, again, I'd prefer not to be pinned down. I think I agree with Sir Jonathan Fall that it is quite difficult to give you a list with a set of countries on the one side and a set of countries on the other side. I think of your list, I would agree that Donald Tusk would probably like the UK to stay. It would, of course, make life much easier for Ireland. I think regarding the other member states, there is a variety of opinions, and I don't think it's as straightforward as saying that, for example, Germany wants the UK out, because even within Germany you have, I mean, there are, I think, some people who would like the UK to change its mind, some people who would probably prefer the UK to be out, so there is quite a variety of opinions, and I think what matters is not only what the countries want, but again, how strongly they feel about it, and would a country like Hungary really stand up to the other 26 and fight for this and fight for its position and use its political capital on the Brexit issue. And I'm not sure that Brexit is necessarily that important to most member states, with a big exception of Ireland, of course, possibly France, because Macron seems quite invested in it in a very different way. But other than that, most member states have different concerns, and certainly countries like Hungary and Poland have their own issues with the EU. And in the context of that, in the context of the rule of law questions, I'm not sure they would really spend a lot of political capital on Brexit and on sort of fighting for and defending a position that may go against the consensus. So I'm not sure the UK can. So even if countries would prefer the UK to stay in, I'm not sure they would necessarily be very passionate allies.
Thank you. Charles?
Well, I have heard a senior official cite the countries you have just named, Mr. Kinnock, but I've heard another senior official say, no, that's completely wrong. Apart from France, they're almost all want to keep us in. And the truth is we don't actually know, and they haven't taken public positions. And as Larissa has said, the opinions are divided. We didn't say Germany. There are different views from different people. They haven't had to take a public position, most of them. I think what has changed in the last 6 months is that even those countries which would like to see the British stay are so fed up they're not prepared to sort of bend over backwards and pull out their fingers to really help them stay that much. I think the example of Sweden I would cite, right? I believe the position of the Swedish government is this, that on balance they would like the British to stay, but they're so fed up with the inability of the British to make up their mind as to what they want that their current position is actually the main priority now is to prevent this whole Brexit mess from contaminating the EU, from polluting the EU, and we must put the position of the EU first, this interest of the EU first, and safeguard it from this sort of potential pollution from the British. So that we'd like you to stay, but actually what matters is the tactics of making sure this deal is sorted out one way or the other quite soon. So that's what the Swedes had a little bit of sympathy for Macron on the length of the extension. They didn't actually support him in the end. They had some sympathy for that reason. So I think the prevalent view of most member states now is get this sorted, whether or not they want the British to stay or not. And many of them don't take strong views on that.
Thank you. One of the arguments we hear from those who are campaigning for a second referendum or to revoke is that the United Kingdom could then be within the European Union and leading the reform of the European Union and leading a new strategic direction for the EU. Given the events that we've seen since June 2016, how would you rate the chances of the UK remaining in the EU and leading reform?
Well, there have been previous attempts to place the United Kingdom at the heart of Europe in a leading position with mixed results. And I don't say that sarcastically. The UK has had a profound impact on the politics and direction of the European Union. And as I said earlier, awkward but constructive member state has done that, and done that reasonably effectively. If the things you describe, Mr. Kinnock, came to pass and the United Kingdom somehow remained a member state, then one constructive path for it to pursue, no doubt, would be, we have learned a great deal from the extraordinary process we've been through in this country and have come to some conclusions or ideas about the way in which the European Union should change and operate differently, and there may well be positive echoes from around Europe. We are not the only Eurosceptic country in Europe. We had perhaps the biggest cocktail of difficulties and resentments and misunderstandings and hostilities because of history and geography and all sorts of other things. But if you take each individual ingredient in that cocktail, you will find other countries across Europe with similar concerns. So adroit leadership could indeed, in what I think are very unlikely circumstances, allow the United Kingdom to take something positive from this experience and help the European Union move forward.
Ms. Brunner, I just wonder if you agree with that. Let's, for example, take President Macron's open letter that he published in a range of newspapers, where he set out key directions for what he thinks is about the reform of the European Union, which is very much about deepening EU integration, defending our liberty, protecting our continent, rediscovering the spirit of progress. Do you think it's remotely realistic that given what we've seen from this country and in this country since 2016, that this country would somehow remain in the European Union and team up with President Macron to drive that reform agenda forward?
I think based on what we've seen since June 2016, that to me would seem rather unlikely. I think based on the past 3 years, it seems to me like that the priorities of the UK would be elsewhere, for example, on limiting free movement somehow, which from certainly Macron's perspective and also the perspective of many other member states would undermine the four freedoms, that would undermine the integrity of the single market. It would seem to me that the priorities of the UK might be to, in a way, explore more options for membership, and I think there the concept of differentiated integration might come into play. So this idea that that there should be something in between membership and non-membership, that there should be different models that allow countries to take part in some parts of the EU architecture and not in others. So to me that would seem like a more likely direction for the UK to focus its reform efforts on. I think it's also worth saying that Macron's proposals are quite controversial among a lot of EU member states. I think he hasn't quite received the positive, he hasn't quite got the reception that he thought he may have hoped for, especially from Germany, which has been rather lukewarm. So I think the whole process, in the end, reform processes in the EU are very often slow steps. They are often driven by necessity. They are often driven by different crises. So in a way, it's sort of integration by accident or integration through crisis. You have a crisis and then you have to come up with a solution. And because it's usually or sometimes easier and more effective to come up with a solution, with an EU-wide solution, than with 27 or 28 national solutions, you go for the EU-wide solution. And then you've sort of integrated a bit further by accident in a way. So I think that is quite often the way that EU integration functions. So it usually doesn't function according to this grand master plan. And so I'm not sure to what extent the UK in moments of crisis would opt for or would be willing to support EU-wide solutions.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I don't know, Charles, if you want to add a
I would like to add a couple of points. I mean, I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Sir Jonathan about Britain's ability to lead a reform process in the EU, because I just think Britain's reputation, its soft power, it's been so damaged by whatever the outcome of the Brexit process. People just take Britain less seriously than they did. So I think we'd have to stand on the naughty step for a couple of years before we really have as much influence as we used to have. In the past, we have a lot of influence on enlargement, on trade issues, on single market issues, on foreign and defence policy, and we could in the long run have influence on those areas again, because the North European free trading countries look to Britain for leadership on those areas, and because Britain's leading, the Dutch have set up a new alliance, the so-called New Hanseatic League, to kind of campaign for these issues, because the British, in the absence of Britain. But I actually also think that, strangely, although Macron does want a more integrated Europe, in fact, we're an obvious ally for him in achieving some of his vision, because his fundamental view is as Larissa, differentiated integration, or variable geometry, or concentric circles. He wants the Eurozone to integrate significantly and thinks it can't survive in a healthy way without a lot more centralisation of decision-making, and he may be right for that reason. But he also says that countries shouldn't have to join the euro if they don't wish to. Let there be an outer circle of countries, a second circle of countries in the single market with no commitment to join the euro, and then a third circle for the sort of Britain, Montenegro, Moldova, Macedonia, countries like that want a close relationship with the EU but don't want to be actually full members. But I think, if Britain decides to stay in the EU, then we would be an ally for Macron in looking for that kind of concentric circle model, with Britain not being obliged to join all the circles. And he doesn't have a lot of allies in that at the moment. I think that the Spanish and the Belgians are allies. The Germans are rather sceptical about it. The Poles and Hungarians are strongly opposed. They think they'd be made second-class citizens of the EU. So I think potentially there could be a convergence of interest between the Macron vision and Britain if it decides to stay in the EU.
Thank you very much. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you.
come back to an earlier answer that you gave Mr Grant about the potential for the United Kingdom, whilst it remains a member, to be a disruptive force, either as a result of direct policy, such as you've mentioned when the tweet from Jacob Rees-Mogg, or simply Britain doing what Britain has always done in Europe, and that has been that it doesn't wish to see further integration or deepening of the European institutions. Either way, is there a disruptive potential there, for example, when it comes to budget negotiations, where, if you look at the plans which the Commission has for deepening Europe, whether it's protective Europe or competitive Europe or fairer Europe, sustainable Europe and influential Europe, all of that will involve more European interference, European generated laws and European spending. Is there a potential there for the British government even pursuing what the normal policy of the UK government would have been in European affairs, to be disruptive in the future? And if that is the case, what actions can Europe take to prevent that kind of disruption?
I think I would argue probably that the potential for disruption is more about style and mood music and rhetoric and less about substance. Some of the top officials in the EU got together to say, if we grant an extension to the British till, say, next spring, what potentially could they do to sort of put a spanner in the works? And the answer was not much. There's not a lot of key legislation going through that requires unanimity. The key budget talk, well, the annual budget, Sir Jonathan, is approved by majority vote. The annual budget is majority vote, so the British can't block that. They can block the big 7-year budget cycle called the multi-annual financial framework, but that isn't going to really be approved and need approval of members till probably next spring or more likely summer. So until then, the British can't do too much damage there. And the one answer that they came up with was the Ukrainian sanction renewal every 6 months. So the sanctions against Russia because of Ukraine. The British have the potential to block that, but they wouldn't block that because the British take a pretty tough line on Russia generally. So some of these top officials thought, actually, there's a limit to the damage they can do on the substance. So that's why the line of many governments was let the British have an extension till next spring. And now the current line of some very senior Commission officials is, look, give them extension till next June 2020, but not beyond. Because beyond, we'd have the multi-annual financial framework being approved, and the British could perhaps disrupt that significantly if they wish to. So I think the disruption that really people fear is the disruption of rhetoric and having a British Prime Minister or British MEPs who are going around shouting and screaming and being impolite. That's what they fear more than vetoing legislation.
So a longer extension is more likely to be influenced, or the willingness to grant the longer extension is more likely to be influenced by the potential that the UK could have for
Yes.
either deliberately or simply by following the policy which would have always been following anyway.
Well, I think they can live with the behaviour of the British governments over the years, so they did learn to live with it. And in fact, the British, although they blocked integration, you're quite right, were actually quite constructive in many other areas, like building the single market. But I agree with what Larissa said earlier, that when the EU considers come October 31st, it probably will have to consider, should we grant a further extension? If the British are perceived as having been very disruptive in the preceding months, particularly the level of rhetoric, then, as Larissa says, there'll be 1 or 2 member states may say that's enough. Ça suffit, let's block a further extension. If the British is perceived to behave in a more constructive way, it'd be harder for Mr Macron or others to say let's not grant them an extension.
Apart from not granting an extension, what other actions can the EU take if they perceive that Britain is being unnecessarily disruptive?
There's not a lot you can do. The Whiteman ruling, and Mr Jonathan Fall will know more about this than I do, being a lawyer. The Whiteman ruling basically said if a country wants to revoke Article 50, it can do so unilaterally. And related to that, the ECJ said, but so long as they remain a member state, they have all the privileges and obligations of a member state. So the French idea, which was if we want an extension, we shouldn't have a commissioner or we should be excluded from some meetings, just doesn't work legally. So so long as we're a member state, there's a limit to the sort of conditions they can put on our continued membership.
Yeah.
I mean, there's disruption, sorry, there are various types of disruption. There's rhetorical disruption, there's breaking the law. And if the disruption takes the form of breaking the law, then of course the European Union has legal mechanisms, including at the end of the day, fining mechanisms, if a member state persistently fails to meet its obligations. And as a member state, it would continue to have rights and obligations. Rights certainly, but obligations too. Now, the system would break down if you go right to the very end of that process and the United Kingdom takes disruption to the extreme and says, well, I'm simply not going to obey your judgments, I'm not going to pay your fines, but then you become an outlaw in the international community, and that's a decision to be made. I hope nobody goes anywhere near that.
What other factor which is bound to influence any further extensions are the current challenges which the EU is facing at present? Could you maybe outline what you see as the main challenges which the EU have to address at present, and also how continued UK membership or continued discussions about withdrawing or exit from Europe is likely to impact on Europe's ability to face up to those challenges?
Well, I mean, just to list them very briefly, I mean, there's the possibility of a trade war against the United States, and the EU is rather divided on how to handle Trump's threats to impose tariffs on car exports. It's dividing the EU, that issue, and it's a very serious matter indeed. There's the Article 7 rule of law issues between the EU and Poland and Hungary and other Central European countries, and the EU's apparent inability to persuade Poland and Hungary to do very much to improve their respect for the rule of law. There's the migration crisis, which is in abeyance but hasn't obviously been solved on a long-term basis. There are fewer refugees and illegal immigrants flowing into the EU than before, but that's because of contingent factors that may not endure forever, like the deal between Turkey and the EU and the situation in Libya. There's the Eurozone crisis, which, as President Macron, I think, rightly argues, is having a rest for now, but will come back at some point and bite the EU very badly unless fundamental reforms are made to the Eurozone. Those are issues which worry member state governments more than Brexit in many respects.
In the view of the panel then, I mean, how important do you see the closing down the whole Brexit issue for the EU in light of the other challenges? I mean, how much time is it absorbing, or energy, or attention, and taken away from those issues?
Well, I would say obviously it would free time for leaders and the administrators to deal with those issues. They are spending a great deal of time on this. On the other hand, it doesn't really answer the question, well, what do we do when the British have left? Because the general view, I think, still is, Mr. Kinnock has left, but to him I would say this is everybody's view, all the member states, that these are all issues which require European attention. These are issues which individual countries can face better together than alone. And the United Kingdom's departure would take out a very powerful voice in the world on all of those issues, where, as Charles said, the UK has had a considerable influence over the years. They will have to regroup without the UK. They'll be watching what the UK does alone on these issues, and I hope interacting intelligently with it. But it'll be a different European Union facing the same problems, requiring the continental scale and scope, which is why the European Union was created in the first place, and there will be a gap because we'll have left.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Junnell.
I think it was Mr. Grant who said that if there was an influx of anti-EU parties coming in, that actually it wouldn't have much of an impact on Brexit at all. Could I just extend that to sort of outside of Brexit? Do you think that a big influx of ultra-nationalist parties would have a political impact on the EU, or more fundamentally, would it have an impact on the institutions of the EU? Mr. Grant.
Well, I do think it'll change the mood rather than the substance. And I do think my own view is that European integration is essentially dead, in the sense that we've had it from the Single European Act until the Lisbon Treaty, one treaty after another every 5 years or so, giving more power to the institutions. And I think that sort of integration is not going to happen possibly ever again, because the difficulties of getting a new treaty through ratification in 27 member states is just too great. Many of those member states, 4 or 5, would hold referendums, and we can all guess what some of the results would be. So that form of integration, I think, is more or less finished, and I think that the European elections will kind of make that remind people of that fact. Another impact of the elections, I think, will be that if the right-wing populists nationalists do well, I think centre-right parties will become more right-wing, a bit more populist, a bit more nationalist. As we've seen this in Spain, didn't do the Spanish PP much good. We've seen this in France, it may not do them much good. We've seen it in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and a number of other, in Austria, a number of centre-right parties are becoming a bit less centre and a bit more right, and that will be one impact of the elections. There is the issue of commissioners. I mean, Italy is a country we haven't mentioned yet, but Italy is perhaps almost the biggest headache for many EU bureaucrats on the Eurozone issue, because it's going to break the budget rules. On the migration issue, it has very strong views as well. And Italy may try and appoint a commissioner who is not a great believer in European integration, let's put it that way. And other countries may do the same, and that will potentially cause problems, though most member states will appoint mainstream commissioners.
So Sir Jonathan, this is a political impact we're talking about so far. Could there be an institutional impact? Could these people undermine the Union at all?
Well, they're there already. The European Parliament already has a reasonably large contingent of Eurosceptics, populist nationalists, and so on. It'll be bigger, but as I think we all said earlier, the most likely outcome of the elections is that there will be a stable coalition between traditional parties, the European People's Party, the Socialists and Democrats, plus Liberals, plus perhaps Greens, depending on the coalition discussions. The governments are governments and remain in place, and it is governments and the leadership of the European Parliament which will end up designating, approving commissioners and presidents in all of these institutions. So the rhetoric may change, the mood may change, the reluctance to reopen treaties may remain, but I don't think this will lead to radical change. After all, radical change probably requires treaty change anyway, which opens a whole Pandora's box, as Charles says, the ratification processes. There has been in recent years, it was part of the story, by the way, of the pre-referendum negotiations between the European Union and this country, where treaty change was ruled out as impractical, couldn't be done in time, which limits the scope of what can be done. But that's the way things are at the moment. The treaties will remain as they are. The leadership is likely to come from orthodox traditional parties in the European countries. Big question mark about Italy, where the government has evinced the traditional parties in that country. We'll see. People have to be designated, approved, and given jobs. And as I think we're all saying in different ways, an era has come to an end, and Brexit is part of that coming to an end. Whatever I think the outcome of the current Brexit turmoil, it's going to be different, but it will become different slowly.
We've been concentrating on the implications of this from the UK perspective in terms of the terms of our withdrawal. But could I just clarify that you also think that there won't be implications in terms of negotiations for our future relationship?
You mean that the rise of Eurosceptic parties Okay. I think I'm not sure it will have a lot of implications because, as we said earlier, the European Parliament will, it will have to agree the political declaration. It will have to agree any eventual deal. But I think if it is recommended, then it will probably do so. So in that case, I wouldn't really expect a lot of resistance from the European Parliament to whatever the future EU-UK relationship is going to look like. I also, again, I don't really buy into this idea that a rise of Eurosceptic parties would reinforce or would create a sense among EU leaders that they have to be tough on the UK and somehow punish the UK, because I think certainly it looks from the EU27 perspective that that isn't really needed because of the disarray in the UK. So in a way, the UK is already doing quite a good job at punishing itself, if I may phrase it that way. But I think it could still impact cooperation a little bit if there is greater pressure in the member states to consider other models of integration. So to, for example, consider more models of differentiated integration, and that goes back to what Charles Grant said about different visions of reform for the EU. And if there is greater pressure within member states or within certain member states to look at, for example, concentric circles, to look at options that are somewhere between full membership and non-membership, then possibly that could make the EU a bit more willing to consider those options.
So you're saying that an extreme nationalist group may be more in favour of concentric circles?
Not necessarily, but if in a given country there is Eurosceptic parties that are advocating for something less than EU membership are very successful, that could pull other mainstream parties in that direction, and therefore that country might become a bit more willing to consider such options.
Thank you. And on a slightly different tact, who would you say are likely to be the front runners for the next Commission President, and which would be the most favourable in the UK's interests?
It's very difficult to say. I'm not sure whether the Spitzenkandidat process is actually going to survive. I think there is a lot of skepticism about it. Emmanuel Macron doesn't support it. I'm also not convinced that the current candidate, if we assume that the European People's Party is going to become the largest group, then according to the Spitzenkandidat process, Manfred Weber should become the next European Commission President. But I think what doesn't work in his favour is that he's German, and as I said before, there are already quite a number of Germans in high-level jobs, so that could be politically a bit difficult. He's also not very well known outside the Brussels bubble. He's never really held high office, so he's never been a head of government or head of state. So those factors.
How does he view the UK?
I haven't really seen very many comments on him from him on Brexit and on the UK. I'm not sure that is really a priority for him at the moment, and something that he has very strong opinions on.
Is that a concern, Sir Jonathan, that it's not a priority for him at the moment?
Well, I think it reflects reality. It is not the all-consuming issue on the other side of the channel that it's become here. And it has been very easy for people to slot in behind generalities about we support Mr. Barnier, who's doing a grand job, and we've done the agreement, and we should all be congratulated for having an agreement. It's now up to the British to approve it in accordance with their own constitutional arrangements, and we're waiting for that to happen. So we've made life very easy again for continental politicians who don't have to have strong positions. Mm-hmm. They can simply echo platitudes about it's all gone very well on our side, it's a pity the British aren't up to the task, or something like that. Doesn't help very much, but it's a very prevalent view. It's embarrassing.
Can I try and answer your question directly?
Yes.
On my last visit to Brussels last week, the names I heard most mentioned were Weber, Vestager, who's another Spitzenkandidat for the Liberal ALDE group, Barnier, who's not a Spitzenkandidat, but I think is a strong contender, Merkel, Lagarde and Rutte. Rutte is talked of as Council President, he's also talked of as Commission President. And in terms of what's good for Britain, I would think Vestager, Merkel, Lagarde and Rutte, all being economically liberal to some degree or other, and quite sensible people as far as I can see, would be relatively good for Britain.
A footnote on the Spitzenkandidat thing is that if you haven't mentioned Mr. Timmermans, who is the Dutch socialist Spitzenkandidat, current first vice president of the Commission. If the Labour Party does reasonably well in the elections and therefore boosts the socialist group in the European Parliament, if the Hungarian Fidesz party leaves the European People's Party, then the Socialists and Democrats, according to opinion poll projections, are not very far behind the EPP in the race to have the largest number of members. So there could be, albeit indirect, a rather considerable British influence if the Spitzenkandidat thing holds up, and there's no reason why it should or shouldn't at this stage. It's part of a great politically correct matrix of big, small, east, west, north, south, old, new, gender balance. There are a number of big jobs open at the same time, and the Commission President is a big one among them, but it's part of that matrix. There used to be a tradition, as Charles said, still is, that you have to be a former Prime Minister to be a member of the Commission. Since Jacques Delors, they all have been, but that's only a convention. And there's no need to do it. Mr. Weber has not even been a minister, I think. No. But the reason for that view, by the way, was that the President of the European Commission is a member of the European Council and attends the European Council meetings, and therefore it helps that he has been a member of the European Council in his previous or her previous capacity, because he or she will know the people and the way the place works and so on. But it doesn't have to be followed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Charles, I want to start with something you mentioned about 20 minutes ago, which is there's a possibility of a further extension. Just to ask you all a couple of questions about the next phase of this. Since the beginning, the EU was quite, you could say clear, you could say rigid, that this had to be done in two parts, that you would have withdrawal agreement first, and then the future would only be negotiated after the UK had already left. And we're told this is what the treaty says, so this is how it has to be. The obvious problem with that is it forces everyone, really, in a way, into something of a blindfold Brexit situation, because the future isn't clear until the UK is already left. If we're in a world of extensions now, and we've already had two small ones, if you like, isn't there a logic to say that this transition period, which has been talked of now for a couple of years and is set down in the current draft agreement, that that period be used to negotiate the future while the UK is still a member? Because the only difference between the two, in terms of rules and obligations on the UK, there's no difference at all. The only difference is the UK loses its seat in the decision-making fora during that period. Is there any prospect, if the UK comes back and applies for a further extension in October, that the process be recast in any way like that?
I've not heard that, Muti. That's an interesting question. What I have heard said at a senior level is that although we say, we being the EU, that the withdrawal agreement is immutable and we won't change one dot or comma, in fact, of course, the more these extensions continue, the more it'll have to be changed in certain respects. Not the Irish backstop, but all the provisions for money will need to be reopened, because if Britain stays in longer, then the budget issues become to the fore. And also the transition. All the arrangements for transition that might need to be rewritten or at least extended. So I think the withdrawal agreement will have to be renegotiated a little bit, or to some degree, if the extensions continue really probably beyond October. But I haven't heard people suggesting that the sequencing be changed in the way you suggest.
Okay, any thoughts on that?
If I may just add, I don't think that it is a completely blindfolded Brexit, because let's not forget that there is the political declaration on the future relationship, and at the moment it is quite vague, so you could I mean, of course, it's not legally binding, so it could be changed, and at the moment it is quite vague, but my sense is that the EU would be willing to make it more precise, and to if the UK decided that it wanted to go for a specific model, whether it's something closer to the Norway Plus relationship, the Canada Plus relationship, something in between. My sense is that the EU would be quite willing to expand the political declaration and put in a clearer vision of what the future EU-UK relationship would look like. And I think from the EU's perspective, that would probably be preferable to extending, because I think any very long extensions would come with a number of risks for the EU that we've already talked about, but if the UK, I think, wanted to change the political declaration, I think that would be might be welcomed in the EU.
Okay. So Jonathan, this phrase, blindfold Brexit, people have looked at this political declaration and described it thus. Do you think it's really all still open and up for grabs, or do you think reading that 20-odd pages or whatever we ended up with, you can actually see what the future is going to look like?
I agree with what has been said. I think that a lot of work could be done on the political declaration if the political will were harnessed on both sides. But this country still has to answer the question, what do you want? And they will go back to the very beginning and say, we hear about taking back control, we hear that the Irish border has to remain open, we hear that the Irish border is no different from other British borders with the European Union because of the territorial integrity of the European Union. So how do you square those various circles in your future relationship with us? That is a starting point, an important starting point. It's not an artificial one, as has been suggested from time to time. It was clearly coming from the very beginning. A lot of people chose to ignore it. We have to go back to that and all the other issues. The 27 will say, I think, we are willing to start within the bounds of Article 50, but there are ways of making progress on the framework of the future relationship, but we haven't got beyond Mr. Barnier saying these are the things on my shelf, which one do you want? And the UK saying, well, it's more complicated than that, it'll have to be something different, sui generis. That engagement hasn't happened yet. Here we are beyond 2 years. It could have been discussed, but it has suited people over there to say we're waiting for the British to make the first shot, as the French say. It's convenient for everybody to park this issue while waiting for London to sort itself out.
Well, that's what I'm driving.
It's not very helpful.
Sorry. I mean, that's what I'm driving at in a way, is that if we're in this world of at least 2 small extensions now, who knows, but between now and October, that this period do be used to give everybody on both sides of the channel greater clarity about what the future holds. Do you think, in a sort of mechanics way, I'll begin with you, Jonathan, on this. This was done with the Commission in the driving seat, Mr. Barnier very much in charge, and the mantra from the member states was we are behind a unified position, and it stayed a unified position all throughout phase 1. If we get into phase 2 of this, and that question you've just posed about what kind of relationship do you want on that Barnier stairway of different flags, or something else out with that structure will stay the same. The Commission will be in charge, there'll be unity behind that, or will there be more, because this is where you really get to the commercial interests of different member states and so on, Do you think we're looking at a more open and fluid process when it comes to negotiating the future?
Well, it will need considerable forceful leadership to break it open, because that's the rut we're stuck in. It's the rut we were stuck in from the day after the referendum, where the road not taken was, we've had a referendum, this is a major political event in European politics, let's sit down and talk about the future. The mantra from Brussels immediately was, Article 50 has to be used, that's what it's there for. You wanted it, by the way, HMG, you wrote it in, so the line was no negotiation without notification. And that went out from Brussels, and the line held in all the 27 countries. So British ambassadors, prime ministers, ministers, no doubt, went to European capitals and were received politely and were told, you remember Article 50, that's what you've got to do, go to Brussels, please. Meanwhile, back here, we had the resignation of the Prime Minister, we had a new Prime Minister who said Brexit means Brexit, and was under enormous pressure to make the Article 50 notification as quickly as possible. So on both sides, we all rushed into this process. And it proved unworkable because we couldn't do it in 2 years. Now, should we have known all that we know now? Probably not. It seemed a long time at the beginning, but actually it wasn't. But the real debate, frankly, hasn't even started about the future relationship between this country and its continent. And given the state of the rest of the world, that's a very serious failing. So whether time can be found within the bounds of the language of Article 50, within the scope of extensions, to have that debate now, we don't know, but it needs to start. It should have started some time ago, and it needs to start pretty soon.
In the Article 50 letter the Prime Minister sent, triggering the clause, I think I'm right in saying that 4 times in that letter the UK government said it was their position that negotiations on the future should take place alongside the negotiations on the divorce. Do you think it was a mistake for the EU to be so rigid about saying no to that?
Well, I mean, alongside happened in the sense that the political declaration was under discussion at the same time as the withdrawal agreement, and the political declaration had to bear the weight of the future relationship. And the very, very rigorous lawyers all said, we can't have trade negotiations with a member state. We have to wait until it's a foreign country before we have trade negotiations. That is technically true, but you can have all sorts of scoping and pre-negotiation discussions about the future. And then history turned out to be what it did. The Irish backstop became a big issue. There was a general election. We know what happened in the general election. We know the makeup of this House. It all became very difficult, and the result of that is we have not had the conversation, as far as I can see, about what the future trading relationship is going to be. There is no consensus here, again, as far as I can see, and I live there, and they haven't yet had to begin to develop a consensus because they've been in the comfortable position of saying we're waiting for the British.
Anything to add on this? I mean, how do we get clarity on the future, and how do we use the extension period to do that? That's really what
I mean, I really agree with Sir Jonathan Fall. I think the EU has been in a relatively easy position. I also think that the sequencing approach was really, it kind of made sense from the EU's perspective at the time, because it weakened the UK's negotiating hand, and it put the UK under a lot of time pressure. And I think at the beginning of the Brexit process, there was a lot of concern about the EU 27 not being able to preserve and to maintain the unity, and there was a lot of concerns about possible divisions among the EU 27. And so I think one key objective of the EU27 has been to preserve this unity, and from that perspective it makes sense to sort of turn the whole Brexit process into something very technical. So take the big political question and break it down into a lot of very technical subtopics, and I think that is probably one of the factors that helped maintain the EU27's unity. So from that perspective, it makes sense. But the problem is, as Sir Jonathan Fall said, there's still this bigger political question to be asked that hasn't really been asked yet, and there hasn't really been a lot of debate in the EU about what the longer-term EU-UK relationship should look like. Also considering the many challenges the EU faces, and to the list Charles Grant mentioned earlier, I would also add the EU's external relations, so its relationship with the US, where the UK has traditionally served as sort of a bridge, its relationship with Russia, where the departure of the UK may also be felt within the EU, as the UK is one of the voices calling for a tougher approach. Also the relationship with China, and I think in that context it is really important for the EU to find some sort of to define its future relationship with the EU, with the UK, and to make sure that Europe, and by that I mean the continent, can continue to speak with one voice, and that you don't have the EU saying one thing and the UK saying another thing. So I think that bigger political question really needs to be asked very soon.
I think it may have been a mistake, perhaps, for the EU to insist on its hardline on the secrecy. Of course, Lord John Kerr, who wrote Article 50, says that his interpretation of Article 50 is that you should negotiate both at the same time. But in a way, it's an academic question, because the UK took 2 years to work out roughly what it wanted in the future relationship with the Chequers plan of June last year. So in a sense, we may blame the EU for imposing the secrecy on us, but we weren't really capable of coming up with any plan of our own. But also, as Larissa says, the EU itself is probably more likely to be divided on the phase 2 of the negotiations than it was on phase 1. The interests of the 27 are quite divergent on the future relationship. It would be hard for them to sort out to work out a common line very quickly, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, John. Jill.
Can I first of all go back to what Mr. Grant said earlier, where you said that you thought that the prospect of further integration was pretty much dead. Is that widely recognised in the Commission? Because it doesn't seem to have dawned on Mr. Juncker, for instance, recently.
No, it's not widely recognised. I mean, there are still some federalists in the EU, mostly in the European Commission and the European Parliament, and one or two governments, but only one or two governments, like Belgium, and in some ways the French government, though France has a rather particular view on this, who do believe that the future is much more integration. And the Commission takes the view that everybody should integrate together, and everybody should be forced to comply with the view that we're much more integrated on the Eurozone and other areas too, majority voting on foreign policy, for example. But most member states don't take that view. I say what's rather unique about Macron's view is he wants to integrate, but only with a smaller number. He wants the Eurozone to become an entity in its own right, a smaller, tight-knit group. And he also wants the Schengen area to become smaller too by kicking out Poland and Hungary from the Schengen area. That's another story. So I think there hasn't been widespread recognition in the institutions that EU integration is dead. But I think the European elections will perhaps lead to some recognition of what is just reality, that most governments and most electorates and most national parliaments in the EU do not wish to see a lot of transfer of a lot of powers to the central institutions. There may be, for pragmatic reasons like keeping the Eurozone afloat, there may be require small treaties amongst Eurozone members, which we've had a few of already in the last few years. Not big 27 countries getting together for a flagship Maastricht treaty type event, but a small little intergovernmental treaty on the sides we had for the European Stability Mechanism, for example. There'll be a few of these smaller ones done as and when is necessary, but there's an awful lot you can do within the existing treaties. I mean, to say that when I say European integration is dead, I mean that the treaty-based integration is dead. There's a lot you can integrate through laws. I mean, the European arrest warrant wasn't in a treaty. It was Sir Jonathan helped to negotiate it. It was actually just a law passed to allow this rather strong powers to be given to the EU for mutual recognition of extradition procedures. So there's a lot you can do without treaties, and that there may be more integration in that respect.
So do you see the kind of variable geometry coming about as a result of groupings within the EU deciding to go further without necessarily having to get the agreement of other member states?
Well, the treaties do allow variable geometry in the so-called enhanced cooperation already with smaller groups, but you do have to get the approval of the others to do it. I suppose you could, if you could conceivably have countries doing things together without getting the others' approval, but that would be quite a radical step forward.
If I may just add, I mean, I agree with what Charles has said, but it depends on what you mean by European integration. If by European integration you mean a grand treaty signed by kings and queens and presidents and so on, yes, I think we're in for a period where we won't have much of that. Will there be further steps that people can describe as European integration? Of course there will. I mean, the general sense, and this is way beyond Brussels, is that on the euro, on Schengen, we have played a first half, can't go back, but have to move forward, and the more difficult second half is ahead of us. So the euro, wonderful thing, in my pocket, comes out of the machines, people have got used to it, but managing it collectively in economic and fiscal policy terms is, of course, extraordinarily difficult. That's a big challenge, but attempts will be made, some of which will succeed, to do that. It's the same with Schengen. Getting rid of the internal borders people have got used to, managing the external borders together requires solidarity, money, and understanding that the borders of the landlocked countries are, in fact, in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. That's all very hard, but efforts will continue to be made, again, some of which will be successful, to move forward. Addressing climate issues, regulating the new digital economy, a lot of that will continue to happen in Brussels. Financial regulation will continue to happen in Brussels, and the steps made can be described as further integration if you want to. But I agree, large-scale set-piece treaties, grandiloquent usually, are unlikely to be seen for a while.
I mean, it has been argued in the past by a number of people in Europe that if the single currency is to be sustained, it is going to require further integration in terms of fiscal centralised agreement. Now, from what you're saying, the countries that are in favour of moving towards integration are unlikely to be those who actually probably require that kind of direction in terms of fiscal policy. So how does that square? Is there still an ambition to extend the Commission's power in terms of oversight of budgetary policy against all member states? And how could that be achieved if it weren't by a treaty?
Shall I?
Okay.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be the Commission. The Commission will want it to be the Commission. It's there, it's equipped, it's resourced for it. But people sometimes invent other institutions or other ways of doing things. I think the overwhelming political interest in continuing to make progress usually only really present after a crisis, unfortunately. That will continue to be the case. How you do it institutionally, if you have to work within the framework of the existing treaties because a big treaty change is not in the offing, is technically difficult. But I spent many years negotiating what is called the banking union for banking supervision and resolution following the financial crisis in 2007-2008. And it can be done. It may be imperfect. Some of it hasn't been tested yet, and I hope it's not for a very long time, because that would mean another crisis. But the European treaties as they stand today, and the decision-making powers of the European institutions, the law-making powers, already provide considerable means of dealing with new issues as they arise. So I think we're saying the same thing, Charles and I. What looks like small steps of further European integration will continue to be made, if you want to call them European integration, because the need for them is there and the means for doing them will be there. The politics will change with Brexit, obviously, different majorities, different balances, but there is very little appetite for grand institutional development.
Thank you. Can I ask one separate question? This committee has met on a number of occasions now, both Michel Barnier and Guy Verhofstadt, and indeed recently Martin Selmayr. And in all our conversations, they've been very amicable. There has been a note of sadness at the decision that the UK has made to leave, but nevertheless an assurance that we wish to remain close partners and friends. I don't know if you've seen the reports of the BBC documentary being broadcast tonight, which was the inside account of some of those on the other side of the negotiating table. Have you seen those? Well, it shows Mr. Verhofstadt's staff calling the Prime Minister pathetic and insane, and then going on to use very strong language about particularly members of my party who support Brexit. It has led to an editorial by The Sun in typically robust language, shall we say, about Mr. Verhofstadt particularly and others. There is an impression that this gives that whereas this divorce proceeding started out relatively amicably with a wish for both sides to reach a mutually satisfactory agreement, it is becoming increasingly acrimonious, and this programme is certainly going to add to that. I just wonder how you view the process and whether, I mean, we know that Mr. Verhofstadt and Mr. Barnier read the British press, and how this is going to influence the negotiations if this level of sort of acrimony has crept in.
Well, I certainly know Mr. Barnier well, and I would be very surprised if he were anything but impeccably polite and courteous. He always is. I think
I don't expect him to be rude
it's
back.
regrettable.
I'm saying whether or not this is actually going to allow us
yeah.
to continue to make progress in negotiation if both sides are so...
It's regrettable but not surprising that 2 years and counting of a very difficult process should leave people irritated and perhaps thinking they're off the record saying things that they shouldn't say. Politics, I don't need to tell you, you're the politicians, I'm not, can be a robust business. But I think the overwhelming sentiment is still one of sadness and regret that this has happened, plus a certain amount of soul-searching about what could have been done to avoid it, and a very strong desire that relationships be recreated on an even keel, because the European Union and the United Kingdom are destined to live next to each other. And have a great deal in common. Britain is a European country, after all. And the sooner, I think we've said this before today, the sooner we can get on to that, the better. But we are stuck in a rut at the moment.
All right.
Can I just
Grant.
chip in? But do you want to chip in?
Just quickly, if you wouldn't mind, just...
Yeah, no, I agree.
Charles?
Just very briefly, I mean, I think there's... Mr. Verhofstadt is not one of the key players in the Brexit negotiations. That's the first point to make. I mean, he thinks he is, but he's one of the Parliament spokesmen on Brexit, or the key spokesman, but he doesn't run the negotiations. I think the negotiations have actually been relatively amicable in most respects. There is a great deal of respect for British officials on the EU side for their technical competence. There is quite a lot of hostility to the political class across all parties, because there's a feeling that British political class just don't know enough about how the EU works, that they fail to come clean to the British people about the trade-offs involved on Brexit, what the facts are, what the realities are. And the fact that British politicians keep on coming back to the so-called Malthouse Compromise again and again, although the EU says it's quite unacceptable, is on the EU side seen as an example of the British political class failing to accept reality. And that has created some hostility to the EU, towards the British political class.
Okay. Stephen Crabb.
Can I return to the panel's remarks in response to one of Pat McFadden's earlier questions? You all spoke about the need for an honest debate and discussion about future relationship and the choices that will need to be made. In the absence of that honest debate, and given how how divided and constrained our body politic is and is likely to continue to be, which will prevent us taking some of these hard decisions in future. Do you think it's a perfectly likely outcome that actually we move into a new steady state in terms of our relationship and membership of the EU, where there are successive extensions, it becomes a rolling extension, we carry on as a member of the EU with one hand on the door handle of the exit door, but with diminishing likelihood of ever walking out of it? Sir Jonathan?
No. I don't think that is sustainable over a long period of time. The EU has to operate, likes to operate, and probably has to because of its nature, in neat categories of what people are doing and how they're doing it under the law. And to create that half in, half out, not very steady state relationship, I think would be very, very disruptive for the way the EU operates. The overwhelming sense, I think, is that this needs to be settled and a new relationship needs to be born. The time taken to do that has proved elastic and may prove elastic again, but it can't go on forever.
Charles?
I agree.
Well, also agree. I'm a bit less. I'm not very optimistic that we are ever going to get to this steady state phase, because I think leaving the EU, I think regardless of the outcome of Brexit, there is going to be more uncertainty, and regardless of whether there's going to be no deal, whether there's going to be a deal, whatever it looks like, or whether the UK decides to remain in the end. Because I mean, any deal will involve trade-offs between political and economic trade-offs. So if you go down the Norway Plus route, for example, the UK would have to accept freedom of movement of people, it would make contributions to the EU budget and so on and so forth, essentially become a rule taker. That might be quite difficult to sell in the UK domestic political context. If you went down the Canada Plus route, there would be quite a high political cost, because it would probably be based on some sort of free trade agreement that would cover goods but not services. So to the UK as a service-based economy, that would have quite a high economic cost. So there might be a pull towards a closer relationship. So again, it wouldn't necessarily, I think because of those trade-offs, it wouldn't really be satisfactory to anyone. I think there would be forces on the one hand pulling the UK towards a closer relationship with the EU, on the other hand there would be those that might advocate for a complete cutting of ties. So I am not very optimistic whether we're going to get to a stable, steady state at all.
So thank you. So if this phase that we're in, and likely to continue to be in for a period of months, if not more, is deeply unsatisfactory to the EU, do you get a sense that they share any responsibility at all for the fact that Brexit, or this stage of Brexit, hasn't been resolved yet?
I think in the Commission there's not much sense of self-criticism, and in the key governments like France and Germany, not much either. But as I said earlier, there are voices, important voices certainly in Germany and a number of member states saying, have we got things a bit wrong? Should we have gone so hard on the should we back the Irish to the hilt in the way they back the Irish? But you hear questions being asked in business lobbies, politicians, but not from the key people running the Brexit talks. They I think they got it right. They haven't yet decided how to handle the future relationship. That is a matter to be discussed at the moment, how to negotiate the future relationship. There will probably be some equivalent of Task Force 50, a central coordinating body within the Commission, but unlike with the first phase, the withdrawal agreement, they need the expertise of DG Trade or DG Justice, whatever, the particular bits of the negotiation. They will farm out bits of it to particular directorates general, but there will be a central coordinating body similar to Task Force 50, run probably by a politician similar to Barney, I would guess.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Jonathan, if you will forgive me, you've made a couple of sporting analogies, and the first one almost seemed to be an apology to Miss Brunner. Just want to reassure you that there's a lot of women playing sport who don't mind sporting analogies.
She's German and therefore unlikely to know about cricket. Nothing to do with her gender, please, for the record.
Well, I will also, for the record, say that we are trying to encourage more women to play cricket in my constituency. So,
but your constituency doesn't extend to Germany, I think.
Well, not yet.
Not yet.
Don't go there. Don't go there.
If I could come back to a comment that was made about tweets of members of the committee that I talked about. I understand that other tweets are also talked about because there's also continuing to be the two broad views that we haven't in some ways moved on from 2 years ago, and clearly the recognition that Britain is still divided. And I had an interesting comment to me recently from a High Commissioner in the UK who said, outside the UK, it seems like such a mess. And he said, I've come here and I feel like I've understood why there is so much still going on because of the roots of what were behind and really part of the causes of Brexit, which is an ongoing debate. But if I could come back to this point about how we how is there a way in which we might shift some of the conversation? And I want to also pick up on your point, Mr. Grant, about the view that political parties are not coming clean with the British people and that there are trade-offs, important trade-offs. Could you say a little bit more about what you think the not the narrative, but what needs to be said that isn't being said in the current climate, bearing in mind we also have EU elections coming up, and we want the public to be informed about some of the deeper issues. What would you say needs to be said more about the trade-offs?
The basic trade-off that's been obvious to the EU since this Brexit business began, which British political class have not really been honest about, and even the Prime Minister, I think, has not fully been honest about, is that if you want to have a close economic relationship with the EU, you have to be a rule taker and give up a lot of sovereignty. But if you want to have your sovereignty and be an independent country making its own decisions, there'll be a lot of trade barriers with the EU which will have a significant economic cost to the country's economic well-being. That's the basic trade-off, and you still don't even hear the Prime Minister say that, let alone other ministers.
And does that surprise you that the Prime Minister isn't saying that to the British people?
Well, I can understand why she didn't say it to the British people, because she when she became Prime Minister, she wanted to convince those people who'd been Leavers that she was committed to their cause and was going to try and implement their cause. And if she then came up with an argument or a line that would appear to be sympathetic to the Remain camp, that would have disrupted, that would have spoilt or damaged her ability to lead a Tory party in which the Leavers are a very strong influence.
There is certainly a view that is looking beyond the immediate into sort of more medium term, and certainly we've had a general election that has shifted to a slightly more of a Remain balance in Parliament. We had the the local elections last week, where arguably the bigger gains were the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, which are a stronger Remain voice. So there still may not be a sort of clarity about where the public stands on Brexit right now. There at some point will be a change in the governance of Britain. At some point there will be a general election. Is this being talked about at all as to whether or not the chaos that we see is chaos, but isn't fundamentally Britain is still the same country, and that there will be a point at which we come through this process, and that the EU needs to plan for that in terms of how we deal with Britain when Britain comes through the period it's currently in?
Well, I would say, it's difficult for me because I'm British but I live there, but what people tell me is that they are sort of discovering a country they didn't really fully understand, because they go to London, they go back. They've discovered devolution, they've discovered the complexity of Northern Ireland, they've discovered a political system in which, very different from most of those, where governments govern, oppositions oppose, which makes the creation of a consensus difficult. And they discover, and what you said I think bears that out, that the country is divided, political parties are divided, Parliament is divided, and that has made it very difficult for a consensual position to emerge. And as I said earlier, that has given a sense of probably false comfort that hard thinking isn't necessary on the other side because we're waiting for the British. They know, of course, that there are elections, and they look at our opinion polls, and they wonder about who might be a future Prime Minister, but they can only deal with what they have, and they have their own political difficulties at home, so they may be prepared to wait, which is why we've had the extensions we've had until things settle down. But I don't know how much of an effort they think they can make, not being particularly self-critical, as Charles has said, at least in institutional Brussels. They're not quite sure what they have to do to break the logjam. They're still, I think, expecting something to happen here.
I think, if I may add, in terms of the future relationship, I think there may be a hope among some on the EU side that that the withdrawal agreement is passed, we get into the transition period is extended, a general election takes place, and that at that point there's going to be some sort of political change in the UK, and that at that point there might be a shift towards a closer relationship with the EU, possibly along the lines of a Norway Plus model. So I think there are certainly some in the EU that would hope that, because after all, a close relationship is in the best interest of the EU as well. But as Jonathan Fall said, I don't think the EU has or sees much scope for influencing that process. I think it's very much waiting for things in the UK to happen.
In a sense, waiting for the things to settle down in the UK, I think it's how long is a piece of string at the moment, and maybe relatively short. Who knows? But there is. There is the sense that the EU is wanting to move on. It's sort of generational. So, 10 Things to Watch report that the European Parliamentary Research Service published in January this year did talk about the future of the EU as one of the key themes. And we do know that there are differences, whether that's going from the sort of 5 key themes that the Commission's published, or Verhofstadt talking about the order of empires, Timmermans talking about the European Union could actually break up, Poland, Polish Prime Minister talking about the need for more flexibility and free nations. So there is an internal debate in which, whilst Brexit is really much more located here now, that this is still part of a mix, and there are still some fundamental questions about the EU and about it and how it's going to sustain its future that not looking at the causes of Brexit would actually have a negative consequence for. Do you think that there is a genuine view to really try and understand the causes of Brexit as much as there is a focus on the deal and the sort of practicalities of Brexit?
Not as much as there should be. Not as much as there should be in the Commission. I think some of the member states, and you cited some member state politicians, do understand that Brexit is a symptom of a bigger malaise affecting the whole European continent. But there is a view in the Commission, not everybody there, but there is a view in the Commission that the British were the pebble in the shoe. And once you remove the pebble from the shoe, we can go back to the good old days of European integration. The more reflective members of the Commission would not take that view, but that is a view one hears in the Commission. So I think the Commission is less self-critical than other parts of the EU.
Thank you very much indeed. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Can I go back to the comment you made quite early on, Mr. Grant, where you described the 2 different sort of tactical approaches being adopted in the EU. Generally speaking, in international negotiations, the deal is that the governments or the representatives negotiate the deal. Each government is implicitly undertaking to get that deal through whatever parliamentary process is needed. What you described, I think, to me, you're describing a situation in which the European Union simply doesn't have confidence in the Prime Minister to get this deal or any deal through Parliament, so the European Union are effectively having to take some kind of involvement in managing the parliamentary process. Does that lack of confidence go far enough to cause a much longer problem? First of all, is it only Theresa May that is seen to be the problem? Would there be an expectation that a different Prime Minister could get that deal through, or could get a different deal through? And secondly, that this is maybe for the other panel members as well, those who now openly promote no deal, which nobody campaigned for at the time, but those who now openly promote no deal promise that in place of a withdrawal agreement and political declaration will have dozens, if not hundreds, of bilateral agreements with the European Union on trade, on customs, on medicines licensing and all the rest of it. All of them will have to be negotiated by a similar process which has failed to get the withdrawal agreement through Parliament. To what extent does the experience of the EU in seeing a negotiated deal not get through Parliament for the withdrawal agreement, is that likely to colour or prejudice the UK's ability to negotiate future deals, either with the European Union or indeed with the rest of the world? If they look at one of the biggest peacetime deals in our history, and they look at the fact that a Prime Minister negotiated a deal that she was never going to be able to get through Parliament.
On your first point, I don't think people on the EU side believe the problem is Theresa May. They have had a lot of respect for her and her tenacity. They're now fed up with her because she promised she could deliver the deal and she couldn't, so they don't kind of trust her on that issue anymore. But they blame the British Parliament. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that the British Parliament's incapable of getting its act together, working out what it wants. They don't believe the current talks between the two big parties are going to go anywhere. They do believe it is highly likely that we'll get to the end of October without anything being sorted out. Their faith in the British political class to sort out this mess is minimal. On your second question, I think that on no deal, I mean, they believe that if we do get to a no deal, which is possible, I think they think more by accident than design, if we do get to no deal, the British won't put up with it for very long. It'll be the economic consequences and the political consequences will be too serious, and within a few weeks we'll be back asking to negotiate some sort of deal. And in any case, if there is a sort of no deal, obviously with mitigating measures taken by both sides to reduce the damage, the EU's starting point for even talking about these measures is the British must accept something very close to the Irish backstop. They must accept a certain degree of budgetary payments, and they must protect the rights of EU citizens living in the UK. So if we get to a no-deal scenario, the EU's condition for talking about mitigating measures is large parts of the withdrawal agreement must be effectively adopted anyway by the British. And then they think they hold all the cards in that, and the British will have to give in.
Thank you. David, the other two witnesses want to come in.
I mean, I agree with that. I think in a no-deal scenario, the UK, I think the EU thinks that the UK is going to be under so much pressure to basically just accept whatever's on the table. And if that's a stripped-down version of the withdrawal agreement, plus a very bare-bones free trade agreement, because realistically that is the only thing that could be negotiated within a few weeks, then I think the EU thinks that the UK is going to accept that.
Thank you.
I would add, perhaps to take it in a slightly different way, they are mostly countries used to having difficulties in getting parliamentary majorities. Several of them are federal in structure, and in many of them there are up to a dozen different parties represented in Parliament, and there are big issues where it's hard to find majorities, whatever the composition of the government. They didn't expect that to happen here, but okay, it's happened here as well. Trade agreements are particularly complicated for the European side as well, because they usually contain components which require national ratification. And in the case of the Great Kingdom of Belgium, where I live, that includes regional parliamentary ratification. So we all got to hear of the Parliament of Wallonia in Namur, which blocked the agreement with Canada, which everybody else had agreed, nearly everybody else had agreed and signed up to. It is provisionally, even today, provisionally only in force, because I think it's the Italian Senate has still to ratify it. So trade agreements are controversial. The European Commission is a very good, experienced trade negotiator. They do the technical job well, but the political ratification process is complicated, and they are used to that. And the EU-UK agreement, or perhaps dozens of EU-UK agreements, will no doubt prove complicated as well and may take some time, which brings us back to the whole justification for the Irish backstop, because what happens during the period between definitive Brexit and the entry into force of the new relationship? And we don't know how long that will take, and everybody says they want the Irish border to remain open, so backstop argument.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Richard Graham.
Thank you very much. You know, when we all look at why getting the withdrawal agreement bill through Parliament has proved so difficult, it seems to me it comes down to the problems created by the structure of the negotiations. If citizens' rights were going to be dealt with up front, there was always a problem with that, because the EU doesn't have the competency, the power, over most of those decisions which are still at the national level. So that was going to be frustrating for us. If then we were going to deal with Northern Ireland first, that was going to be satisfactory, because without a future destination, you can't deal with whether there'd be a need for border checks or not. And that then leaves you with money, financial obligations, and a feeling over here that agreeing on what looks like a pretty big bill without knowing what the future benefits were going to be, again, feels uncomfortable. Do you think, in retrospect, that there is any appetite in the EU for really understanding the nature of that frustration here with structuring the negotiations in that way? I know you've touched on this earlier, but very briefly, Charles Grant.
As I said before, I think there is some hints of self-criticism coming in, even from within the Commission, though not those directly involved in the negotiations. Did we get this all right? Did we handle things the perfect way? You hear gentle hints of this now. But as I said before, the British would not, even if the EU had said, well, let's do both at the same time, as you know, arguably is you have quite a strong logic to what you're saying. It would have been better to do so. The withdrawal agreement might have been more palatable if we had a detailed trade relationship negotiated. Even if the EU had agreed to do both at the same time, that would have required the British government to decide what kind of future relationship it wanted. And it hasn't been able to do so. It sort of came up with the Chequers agreement, but then some members of the government left the government because of that, the Chequers plan. The EU rejected the Chequers plan anyway. So I think, in theory, you're right. In practice, I'm not sure it would have made much difference.
Larissa Brunner.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think, and also I would add that from the EU's perspective, I think it made sense to focus on the topics on the issues of separation first, in order to maintain unity among the EU 27, because I think the next phase of the negotiations is going to be much more divisive. Different countries will have different priorities. They will have the different individual wish lists of what they would like the Commission to achieve in the negotiations on the future EU-UK relationships. So. And that could have undermined EU unity at quite a critical stage. And to prevent that, I think, was one of the main objectives of the EU. So from the EU's perspective, it made sense.
So it kept their unity, but possibly at the cost of making it harder to get through here. Jonathan Fall.
I'm not sure. Sorry, really quickly. Because I would agree with Charles Grant that in practice, I don't think it would have made much difference. Sorry.
I tend to agree with both my fellow panelists, and I certainly believe that 2 years would not have been enough, were predictably not going to be enough to do both things, just because of the need on both sides to have a serious thinking process, first of all, about what the future trading relationship would look like. For the political reasons I outlined earlier, I understand why both sides jumped onto Article 50 as soon as possible and felt compelled to, but that created an infernal deadline problem which we haven't found a way out of yet.
Thank you. And I mean, if we look at the current issue of the day here, which is really all about customs union, customs arrangement, customs partnership, it feels very much as if the consequence of the sort of withdrawal agreement frustrations on both sides has created an easy opportunity for populists to really focus on two slogans: leave means leave, and then painting any continuation of the relationship as Brexit in name only. And on the other side, that we have failed to illustrate why compromise and continuity of relationship matters, even if everybody understands at a personal level that divorce without arrangements on children, home, finance and pets almost always ends in tears. What do you all think that the government could still do to try and bring alive better the benefits of the practical relationship, and in particular the customs union? Can I start with Charles Grant again?
Well, whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the customs union, and there are pros and cons, it's hard to really see it as Brino, because it doesn't affect, it would not affect most of the British economy. Most of the British economy is services, and we would be outside the single market for services. We'd also be outside the single market for goods, so there would still be a need for regulatory checks for compliance with single market rules on goods going across, goods or animals or plants going across borders. So it would reduce the friction for manufacturers. That's quite an important, for supply chains would be less friction, but it doesn't actually do a lot for most of the economy.
And goods are actually 50% of exports.
That's true, that's true. So it affects quite good for exports to be in the customs union, but it doesn't remove the need for border checks for compliance with single market rules.
How would you, if you were advocating continuity of relationship in the form of customs partnership, how would you best sum it up in sort of one sentence if you were trying to persuade a frustrated British population?
And I would say customs checks at the border, particularly for compliance with rules of origin, would be a real encumbrance to manufacturers in Britain. And if you can get rid of those checks through joining a customs union with the EU, in which the EU would give you a consultation mechanism, if not a vote, would be very helpful to manufacturers.
Thank you. Larissa.
If I had to sum it up, I would say something along the lines of any outcome has trade-offs, and in the case of customs union, the benefits might outweigh the potential costs. Because I think it's really, I mean, as Charles Grant said earlier, it's really important to make clear that there are trade-offs involved between economic costs and the political considerations like political sovereignty. And I think that perhaps has not been made clear enough.
Thank you. Jonathan Ford.
I agree. I think we have to move away from slogans because they hide reality rather than enhance it. Somebody mentioned, Giles, I think, plants and animals. There are plants and animals being checked between Larne and Stranraer, two ports in this country, as we speak, no doubt. Life is complicated. Trade is complicated. Customs is, in a way, however emblematic and difficult it's become, the easy but the incomplete answer to a lot of questions. It's, in a way, yesterday's problem. Customs duties and tariffs have gradually, because of the UK in the EU largely, been eroded over the years. Modern trade is regulated by regulation. It is the way that modern states protect consumers and financial stability and the environment, all the things they want to protect. They do so by regulating goods and services. That is the obstacle to world trade, which people have spent years trying to overcome, and the European Union, not completely successfully, has found services liberalisation to be very important and to be very difficult. So it has lagged behind the other freedoms of movement in the European Union, let alone internationally. Now, this is not a one-line answer to your question, but a political explanation and discussion of the trade-offs has to explain that a simple slogan like Brexit means leaving the customs union. Frankly, it doesn't, because there are countries outside the European Union in a customs arrangement with the customs union, so quite technically that is wrong. There are various things that need to be discussed, and then decisions need to be taken about them, about the future trade relationship with between this country and its nearest neighbours. Frankly, humbly, I have to say that slogans and tweets don't capture the full complexity of the problem.
Okay.
Chairman, if I may, very
quickly, yeah,
briefly.
because we missed.
John Ford, just on that point, it's quite a technical question, but the major concern for many people here about a customs partnership or union is around the implications of the common external tariff and whether that would actually mean that once the EU has negotiated future FTAs with other nations, they would have full access to our markets without us necessarily having access to theirs, while if we lowered our customs tariffs to, let's say, 0 for the EU, that would then apply under MFN rules to everybody else in the world, therefore giving us effectively an independent trade policy that didn't amount to anything very much. Do you have any words of comfort on that?
Not really. I mean, it is the nature of a customs union, a full customs union, that you have the same tariffs at your external border vis-à-vis the rest of the world. There can be other customs arrangements, and the word has been used but never defined, which fall short of that. And there can, of course, be, and indeed there are, consultation arrangements to be put in place between the customs union itself and those associated with it. So there may be scope for discussion and negotiation. But at the heart of it, the customs union idea is that you have freedom within and a common posture vis-à-vis the rest of the world.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
All three of you made reference to the fact that it took a long time for the UK government to work out what it wanted. Supposing a miracle happened, from the point of view of those who want Brexit
To pursue sport, see Anfield last night.
Pardon? Well, miracle, yes, indeed. Yes. Supposing an Anfield-style miracle would happen, from the point of view of those who favour getting on with this, and a deal was done and the legislation went through, do you think the EU thinks that the UK side is ready for phase 2 negotiations, for the trade-offs, as you put it, Mr. Grant, that will have to be made? Is that the perception of the EU side, that suddenly the UK will say, OK, yeah, we want this, this, this and this?
The perception is we're far from ready to get our act together, which comes back to the question of the extension we touched on earlier. If the UK has a plan, like let's have a referendum, or let's have a general election, or let's have a completely new approach because we have got our act together and we have decided what we want, then the EU will have no problem with rolling over the Article 50, and even Mr Macron would say yes to that. The problem is they think we're not yet in that position. We don't have a plan.
OK, and is there any discussion about the future of free movement amongst the other member states?
I mean, I haven't really seen any discussion of the principle. There has been some discussion about certain aspects. So, for example, about child benefits. So, for example, whether, for example, if a Polish individual lives in Germany but his or her children live in Poland, whether they should receive German child benefits. So quite technical aspects, but I haven't seen any serious discussion about the principle of free movement, because I think my sense is that it is seen as a largely positive thing, even though there are, of course, some concerns, but on balance, it is seen as a largely positive thing.
I agree. There is no sort of mega high-level discussion about the principle. There are endless rows about it. There's litigation. It's a hot issue in the internal politics of some countries, both emigration and immigration, tending to focus on from outside the EU rather than fellow Europeans. But it is not today a major issue. There is simple example, one of the provisions agreed in the pre-referendum agreement between the UK and the EU was that there could be indexation of child benefit based on the location of the child. So a Polish worker, for example, in the UK with children in Poland would receive child benefit at Polish rates, not at British rates. That has now been imitated, I understand, by Austria, and the Commission is challenging it. So the debate rumbles on, but nobody is saying, as they might have said at any time between, I don't know, in the last 10 years, it is time to think again about what free movement means in a union of 28 very different countries, following the enlargement of the union, following the economic crisis. Do we want to look again at some of the principles and rules that were established in a completely different era? Nobody's saying that.
Most mainstream politicians in most EU countries do not question the principle of free movement. There are some exceptions, like in the Netherlands I know mainstream politicians who do, but most of them in most countries do not, in my view.
Okay. Well, on behalf of the committee, can I thank you very much for coming today. That has been a really useful and informative and interesting session. Thank you.